Hello everyone and welcome to a very special Fight and Focus. I'm Josh Shernoff and today I am joined by the author of the new book, Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19, Keith Elliot Greenberg. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here.
Thank you, Josh, for having me.
Oh, I'm excited to talk about this book. Right off the bat, I just want to talk about, you're in London right now as we're doing this. You just wrapped up a book tour in London. How was that?
In the UK.
In the UK, okay.
I was in Glasgow, I was in Manchester, and I was in London last night.
Okay.
I'm a monthly columnist for Inside the Ropes magazine.
Kenny McIntosh.
Yes, Kenny
Great
McIntosh.
Guy. Yep.
And Inside the Ropes was they're part of a franchise founded by Kenny, which does these tours where they have wrestling legends come over and speak to people in a nightclub or a theater. They'll draw hundreds of people for one of these sessions. And so there were 2 William Regal sessions and there was a RVD session. And I tagged along to sign some books. And it actually went even better than my projections.
Oh, well, can't beat that. I want to jump right in to this book, Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. What I found, I didn't know what to think when I first started reading the book. And what I found fascinating was the parallels, how you went back and forth politically with what is going on or was going on at the time in the United States. And then, of course, with COVID-19 in the world. Was that your intention? When you first set out and said, hey, I'm going to write a book about wrestling in 2020, and you can take us back on that. You had just finished a book before, you were ready to start a new one. Obviously, no idea what this book was going to end up being about. Did you always have the intent of following some sort of either political climate or what was going on in pop culture or the world juxtaposed to wrestling? Or was it just the time that we're in? How could you not follow those?
I think it was a little bit of both. I'm sure you're familiar with the book and later on the ESPN miniseries, Ladies and Gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning. And that focuses on the 1977 New York Yankees, but it also incorporates the Son of Sam killings, the blackout of 77 and the looting that followed, all the chaos that occurred. And that was a time when even if you wanted to lose yourself in baseball, you couldn't ignore what was going on outside. I mean, there was a fire going on at Yankee State, outside of Yankee Stadium, hence the name, the Ladies and Gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning. So I initially wanted, my last book is Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. That came out in 2020. And it ends in 2019, just before the start of the first Dynamite taping, the Dynamite broadcast. And so it was essentially a cliffhanger. Here's the story of the indie wrestling revolution, and here's the next, we're about to go to the next chapter. So I knew that there had to be a sequel. And fortunately, my executive editor at ECW Press, Michael Holmes, agreed with me. And by the time I finished the epilogue, the international pandemic had been declared by the World Health Organization. And at that stage, instead of scrapping the book, because I could have done that and just said, well, wrestling and everything involving the indie wrestling revolution is on hold till we know better. I decided to make it a snapshot of history, but it was a snapshot of living history because I was writing the book as events were unfolding. And it was unavoidable. You have 2020. I'm over in the UK now, that there was Brexit going on in the UK. Yeah. And in the United States, we were having, certainly in my lifetime, the most contentious presidential election that perhaps in our history, but at the very least, since anything I can remember.
Sure.
And so I didn't feel that we could tell the story without, including those events.
No, and I think it's the way that you broke it down in the beginning specifically, where you're almost talking about, hey, you remember what was going on while you were watching wrestling here, while Sammy Guevara was entering the ring. Hey, here's what was going on in the rest of the world at that exact moment, and it really, the past few years, I think for all of us have just been, whether you have a tremendous memory or not, you are so thrown off by dates and times now where you go, oh, that was a year ago. No, God, that was 3 years ago. You're so, confused by that. One thing in particular was, we just, as we're recording this last night, was the 3-year anniversary of Dynamite. And I was there for the first Dynamite. I got to host the pre-show here on FITE, and it was amazing to me both that it was only 3 years and that it was a whole 3 years, because in some ways I can't place where that was. I would have put that as 3 years before the pandemic started, not a couple months, right?
I agree. And it almost is like there's an edit in people's lives. Like, I had a conversation recently with a woman in Los Angeles, and she has a 2-year-old. And she says, she's just starting now to get together with old friends who she hasn't seen all through COVID. And so the last time she saw these people, she wasn't even pregnant. Wow. And now she's the mother of a child who walks and talks. Yep. And it's like, what happened? It's almost like this dream that we sleepwalked through.
Yeah.
And I think, had I not been keeping a very careful tally of everything that was that was transpiring, both in pro wrestling and in the wider world, I would have forgotten a lot of this information too. And even rereading my own book, which I've been doing because I've been getting interviewed by a lot of people.
Sure.
I'll open up a section. I'll go, man, I've forgotten about that. I kind of wanted to forget about it.
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that's most interesting about it, again, like you talked about your previous book, was the rise of indie wrestling. Now this new boom in indie wrestling, and a lot of people would say I think the boom in indie wrestling has continued. I think that somehow was able to weather the storm of the pandemic, which is phenomenal, especially for the wrestlers who, a lot of them, that's a source of their income, and it just was wiped out. So it's great that they're able to do that. One quote I think you had in the book was with Joey Janela, talking about how lucky he was to have found himself in AEW at the time, because had this been a year earlier, he would have been one of those people who was just, oh, sorry, everything's shut down. You can't work. You're hoping to sell your shirts out of your garage. But he had talked about what a great opportunity it was. So I just think that the juxtaposition, just looking at the real world and the wrestling world is fascinating. But again, back to the indie wrestling thing. So that boom, a lot of people believe that led to AEW. I mean, how could you not believe that led to AEW?
Well, it did. I mean, that was where everything was going. Mm-hmm. I mean, you had the original All In, mm-hmm. Which Ring of Honor, ironically, helped out on. But that was the prior regime of Ring of Honor, owned by Sinclair Broadcasting. Right. And that directly led to the formation of AEW. But all of this started both in the indies and prior to that in the outlaw promotions of the early, I traced that book to around the early 1960s, where I talk about renegade promotions that challenged the established promotions. So the established promotions being NWA, of course, Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and the AWA, and how that all evolved over time, and how there were different phases of indie wrestling. 2012 was a banner year where you had new ownership of New Japan. I'm not going to call New Japan indie by any chance, but it still is an alternative to some of the major promotions here. They've worked with AEW. They were challenging WWE by staging shows in the United States. And they continued to stage shows in empty arenas during COVID. So 2012, you have new ownership for New Japan. You have Rev Pro and Progress starting in the UK. And you have this like burst of creativity in Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. And, and who's one of the owners of Pro Wrestling Guerrilla? Excalibur, the, AEW announcer. So you can't isolate the formation of AEW without, going back to the indies. It's like talking about the roots of rock and roll and ignoring the blues.
So,
But yeah.
no, I'm sorry. Continue.
No, so I mean, I want to circle this back to what happened during COVID. Now, during COVID, I do chronicle the indie promotions that managed to be resourceful and thrive during that. Well, survive during that period. I mean, GCW, Game Changer Wrestling in particular, I attended several of their outdoor shows in the summer of 2020 before we had vaccines. They were doing outdoor shows regularly at a park in Indiana, and they would have people just socially distanced across the lawn. So there'd be pods of, say, 4 to 6 people. And they, sorry about that. I think I got an email and you heard the bell ring.
No, you're good.
But
you're a busy man. We understand. Yeah. It's okay.
But you would have pods of people there, and I remember, they had sanitizing stations. Nobody quite knew how to stay safe.
Sure.
You walked into the dressing room, and Ricky Shane, Page, who was their champion, is like walking around with the digital monitor in his hand, digital thermometer, taking people's temperatures. So at the time, they are trying to be as safe as possible. Everyone's masked. There's sanitizing stations. They're trying to survive, and they're trying to be ahead of the curve. Like I described one match where as soon as it's over, one of the wrestlers rolls out, walks over to the timekeeper's table, and gets a squirt of sanitizer. And if you recall, we didn't really know how to stay safe back then.
We didn't know at the time that it was airborne.
Right.
So,
I mean, we weren't quite sure. Like, do you remember, people sanitizing surfaces? I remember going into a Dunkin' Donuts and a woman being there with a small child and her dropping her napkins on the floor. And I bent down to hand her the napkins, and she recoiled like, oh my God, like you touched that. There could be the virus on there.
Sure.
And, and I can't mock her. I mean, nobody really knew. Oh. And I feel this book takes you back to that period, but also we're talking about professional wrestling, and you can't do professional wrestling without touching people.
Right.
So here you have these men and women who are risking their lives, essentially. They're already risking their bodies in order to provide some form of release for the fans, and they needed to do it too emotionally because that's what gives them life.
So the multiple companies now, you mentioned what GCW was doing, you mentioned New Japan, what they had done, but focusing purely, let's say, on WWE and AEW, right, the big two, they had different approaches to this, and I'm curious your opinion as a historian, as a fan, which you preferred. Now, obviously, I don't think anyone preferred the original empty
Right.
arena. It was just, and I put no blame on anybody for that. That was just, everyone's, as you mentioned, we're figuring it out as we go along here. They're trying to continue to have content. There was the awkward video stream that went out during one of the tag matches, the women's tag match, where they just stopped for commercial break. And look, but everybody, you can forgive. I don't even see that on any of the botched things that you see online.
Because it wasn't a botch.
No.
Nobody knew.
Exactly. But what did you prefer between AEW, which had I mean, it was almost like Austin Gunn's coming out party to be in the audience there. He did such a great job, but they had their roster who wasn't working around the ring as an audience versus WWE that ended up going from nobody to the Thunderdome, which was this virtual, for anyone who didn't pay attention during that time. It was just screens surrounding this massive
1,000 screens. Yeah.
and it was people could log in from at home and they could be on there and they could cheer and they could boo, but the sound that was going through was piped in. That was not real. It was
At times, yes.
Which one did you prefer?
I mean, I don't want to say I preferred either. They both offered something.
Mm-hmm.
Now, initially you had the wrestlers from AEW around ringside, and they would make noise, and I think they were sincere in the way they cheered and booed. They turned into wrestling fans because that's why they're in this business.
Sure.
They all of us who are connected to the business, whether as talent or as Mike Johnson from PW Insider says, or the barnacles on the boat, like I am, just writing about this stuff. But we all started out as fans.
Right.
So I think that was sincere, and it was something of a studio wrestling vibe, like going back to, the territory days, and I enjoyed it. WWE, I remember, and it's in the book, there were quotes from higher ups at WWE saying they didn't think that was safe. Again, they're trying to protect their talent. They don't want any mishaps. They also don't want a public relations disaster if a bunch of people are sitting around the ring and they all contract COVID. But eventually, the decision was made to spend the enormous amount of money it took, and fortunately the company has the money, to create the Thunderdome. Right. And I will say, at first I was very conscious of the Thunderdome. I think John Moxley, who had since jumped to AEW, described it as dystopian. And then after a while, I gave into it, and they improved the audio. Yeah. And, they improved the presentation every week. And I remember watching what I believe was a Royal Rumble with the Thunderdome, and actually feeling like, wow, this replicates a live audience. And there's someone in the book affiliated with WWE who's quoted as saying, well, maybe even after the COVID era ends, we'll be able to use the Thunderdome in some capacity. And in that moment, I was thinking the same way, because that was my reality. And I'm like, wow, this works pretty well. Maybe there is a way to use it later on. But of course, now that we have live crowds again, why do you need a bunch of LED screens around the ring?
And I think a lot of it was also, they had shifted their mindset during that time period. They had shifted to saying, okay, hey, this might be the new normal for, Lord knows how long. So let's turn a negative into a positive, or at least a not as negative, right? And so I do think that, personally for me, I preferred AEW's presentation at that time more than WWE's, just because WWE's presentation had already felt somewhat sterile. So now you've removed the only non-controlled aspect of your broadcast. So it made everything just a little too sterile, and the conspiracy theorist in me could look at it and say, oh, Vince McMahon loved that because now he had control over the one thing he never had control over, which was the fans. But
he didn't. He didn't, because there were, if you recall, and it's in the book, there was somebody held up, I think, a swastika or a Nazi sign there.
Yeah, there was Ku Klux Klan or something like that.
Klan. Yeah, there was some white supremacist symbol that was put up, and of course, WWE was quick to declare this person is banned from participating in any WWE event for life. Right. I don't know how you track that person. I remember there was somebody I heard about who was allegedly banned from the New Jersey Meadowlands for acting up at a WWE event. did every usher have his name,
Yeah,
like,
right.
his face memorized? But, their heart was in the right place. They
Right.
certainly were embarrassed by that. Someone held up an image of Chris Benoit, which is,
Yeah.
who represents perhaps the most disturbing incident ever associated with professional wrestling.
Yeah.
There was someone held up an image of Kenny Omega, and Kenny Omega made a joke about it on social media. So there wasn't 100% control. These people are still fans, and you have 1,000 faces, and something is going to get through.
Yeah.
But yes, I can understand why you would think the audience is being controlled a lot more than at a typical live event.
Sure. And it probably is worth pointing out that we're not bunching Kenny Omega into the same group as Chris Benoit and a Ku Klux
Absolutely
Klan
not.
member, but
No,
I know
certainly
you're not. I just want to make sure before anybody runs with that on the internet. No,
No,
but
absolutely not.
no, of course not. But it's the point
what they
of the
were doing
control.
was they were tweaking WWE by
Yeah.
putting up the image of the rival promotion's big star.
Sure.
That's what they were doing. The other things were done with far more malice. There's nothing funny about what happened to Chris Benoit and his family. It's tragic, and I think anybody who came across him as I did still feels that to this day. And you feel the tragedy because in person, I'm going to say it, he was not a bad guy. And so what happened? What went so wrong? And, Nancy was a lovely person, his wife. So it's something I think everybody who crossed paths with him on a regular basis still carries. And it's quite disturbing.
And nobody, I mean, and that is the thing. Fans did, and it was a very small amount of fans, but some did take advantage of the fact that nobody could come in and pull their sign down, right, and kick them out of the building.
Right.
Look, it was a fascinating time, and what I really thought was interesting was something that you said in the book was that 2020 was gearing up to be the best year to be a wrestling fan, and you're not sure that it wasn't. And I thought that was interesting because it was so unorthodox in the way that we perceive wrestling. But man, did it carry us through when everything else stopped? There was still pro wrestling as I know somebody once referred to pro wrestling as like pizza. No matter how bad it is, it's still pizza.
Right.
And that's the thing. So no matter how bad it was, it still gave us something. We still were able to tune in. Okay, where are our favorite stars? What's going on with this? And we were able to forgive a lot of things like storylines maybe that weren't, and also what was kind of neat was we got to watch the growth of this technology and the ideas that these companies were having, and we were getting to watch in real time as they were coming up with it. And that's kind of what you follow along with in the book. And then again, what I love about it is while you're doing that, you continuously jump back to say, and here's what was going on in the world, to put in some context for all of us who have completely lost context over those last few years. I think it's marvelously put together. It's a great book. I encourage anybody to get the book. Where is it available at this point?
Well, I mean, if you live in a community that has bookstores still, if they haven't all shut down, you can go into a bookstore and get it. But it's, the publisher is ECW Press. You could always get it from their website. It's on Amazon. And, I'm in the UK now, WH Smith. If it's not in the stores, you could get it from one of those websites. I mean, any website that sells books. I mean, ECW Press is a real company.
Yep.
So it's not like you have to scour the dark web to find the book. It's available.
So not only that, but you're also going to be having a launch party. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and everybody listening is invited to this launch party. This launch party will take place Thursday night, October 13th. At Lucky 13, which is known as New York City's only metal bikini bar. And that doesn't mean that the people wear metal bikinis, but some of the dancers do wear bikinis. And I even have a list of the dancers who will be there that night. For those who are, let's see, Leia, Kiska, and Happy. So if you're a supporter of Lucky 13 and go there regularly, those are the dancers you'll see. But I'm extending an open invitation. It's my book release party. I've ordered lots of books to be available for me to sign. And, it's a community of, we all went through this as a community. This is a book for, I would say, for the analytical wrestling fan. And we are part of the same community. And so, I have my own motives. I'm trying to sell a book.
Sure,
but, but let's have a party. Like everybody who can get there, let's come together as a community and hang out and laugh and talk about this stuff. And so everyone's invited to that. And if somehow you miss it, or you're one of those people who lives in northeastern Queens in Long Island and doesn't venture past Citi Field, well, 2 days later on Saturday, October 15th, I will be signing books at the Wrestling Universe in Queens on Francis Lewis Boulevard, walking distance from where I grew up. So it's something of a triumph for me. And, Dean Malenko will be signing books there at the same time.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. Wrestling Universe, a great place.
Not books, I'm sorry. Dean Malenko will be signing autographs at the same time.
Okay. And look, if you want to get Follow the Buzzards signed by Dean Malenko, why not? He'll be there, right?
Yeah.
Get him to sign that as well.
There. Right. Well, I think he has his own merchandise to sell.
I'm pretty sure, yeah. The book is Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. Keith Elliot Greenberg, thank you so much for taking the time here to talk about this. It is a phenomenal read. Go right now, get it on Amazon, get it at a bookstore. Go to the book party October 13th. Whatever you have to do, don't miss out on this book. It is a great read. Again, Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. Keith Elliot Greenberg, thank you so much for taking the time.
I really appreciate you inviting me here, Josh.
Absolutely.